This is a rare occasion that I will bring and print off for everybody in the church the exegesis sheet that I developed for the passage that we're studying. Now, if you're looking at that, you are seeing the way that I study the Bible, the way that I was really taught and trained to study the Bible in Colorado. And the reason why I printed this off and wanted you to have one, this is going to be the passage that we're going to look at for at least 2 Sundays, so at least this week and next week, but even potentially for a 3rd Sunday, is because in the years that I have been studying the Bible, and the years that 7 years that I've been in full-time ministry, this is one of the most difficult passages that I think I've ever tried to understand what it meant. Romans 3, 1 through 9. And to be sure, there are a lot of difficult passages in the scriptures. Ezekiel's prophecy, the second half of Daniel, Matthew 24 will give you a run for your money. But this one for different reasons. And part of it is because Paul he's continuously bringing these rhetorical questions that he kind of answers, and it looks like this is a question that either the audience to whom he's writing has expressly mentioned it, or there is some kind of slanderous charge to that end that Paul is aware of, or Paul, knowing through the Holy Spirit the kinds of things that people would say to his message, he anticipates it with their rhetoric, and then he responds to it. So if you're looking at that exegesis sheet, if you look up at the top, that is the key to understanding the what might appear to be a bunch of random colors. Up at the top, there are 3 parts to how I've broken this down. The opponent's rhetoric, which is the light blue. And anywhere you see in this passage, Romans 3, 1 through 9, that's highlighted in light blue, you are seeing what the opponent is saying to Paul. Now, that does not mean that Paul is sitting there in a dialogue with them. Obviously, Paul is somewhere else and he's writing to Rome. But Paul is anticipating this. And there are actually a couple indications, specifically what he says toward the end, where he talks about something that people blasphemously said about the apostles or those who were giving the message. So we do know that these were things that were actually being said. So there's the opponent's rhetoric. Then in yellow is Paul's response. And then you see in that turquoise color, every time when Paul says something that, if you were just studying the passage without any color coding, you might think, is Paul saying this? Did Paul just make this statement? Or is Paul saying that's a statement that shouldn't have been said? Well, the turquoise kind of points out where Paul is saying this shouldn't be this way. And so I have written there, the turquoise is where Paul thinks their rhetoric to be reprehensible. So he says, may it never be. He says that 2 times. He says there at the end, their condemnation is just. So you have these indications where Paul's saying, I do not agree at all with what I just said, because it's not really me that's saying it. I'm just saying what somebody else said. And let me just tell you why this is so difficult. In the Greek language, there is no punctuation. There are no question marks. There are no periods. There are no quotation marks. That when I say there's no punctuation, there is literally no punctuation in the original Greek language. It is one continuous stream. In fact, there aren't even spaces between words. So it's up to the translator to determine where the periods go. And you can tell because in Greek, there are different cases for nouns and verbs and whatever else. So you know if it's in the nominative case, we're talking about the subject of the sentence. This isn't an issue. But when you're talking about rhetoric, see, if I wrote out this rhetoric, I would have written, my opponent is saying this with a little colon, and then I would give their quotation. And then you would know really easily in English, okay, he's not saying this, it's the opponent that's saying this. But it isn't that way when you read the Bible. There are no quotation marks. So you have to go through, and I think that's part of what made this so difficult. Now, I do think I have a handle on it finally. And so we're going to spend 2 or 3 weeks looking at this passage. Having given all that preliminary introduction stuff about what you have in front of you, I'll just tell you, here's how we're going to do our outline today. I'm going to do a blue part, then a yellow part, then a blue part, then a yellow part. So if you looked on your page, there are 4 parts we're going to go through. That's an outline for the message today. Once I get to that second yellow part, we're going to talk a little bit about that, and we're going to pick up with that same spot next week. So that's your outline for this morning. Now to get us started. Let's say that you're wrong about something, a concept that you hold, an idea. Maybe it's an ethic. Maybe it's a political position. Maybe it's a religious persuasion. Maybe it's a conception you have of what the Bible is saying. And so let's just say you have an idea that you hold or a concept that you hold, and in addition, it's something that's especially dear to you. Perhaps because it's something that all the rest of your family also believes, or because it's something that you've sort of built your life around and you've invested a lot into this idea, whatever that might be. Okay? But let's say that you're wrong. Let's say there's a really dear central thing that you have built your life around, and by building your life around it, you have created a ton of evidence to prove what you believe to be your outlook on life. You don't just do that haphazardly. If you have something that you believe totally to be true, you probably have very good reason to believe it. Now, your reasons may stink, but in your mind, they might appear to be really good. So let's say you have an idea and you hold it, but it's wrong. And then somebody comes along and they present to you evidence to the contrary. My question for you as we go into the study this morning is, if that were you, if you held a dear concept and you were wrong within it, would you have enough of a love for truth to rise out of your false concept and change your life based on what it's calling you to do? What do you think about that? We'd probably all say, I'd hope that I would do that. But again, if it's something really dear to you and everybody you love does it, if numbers mean anything, looking at the population of the world, the majority of people, when presented with the truth, they would not change. They would probably say, well, what they just said wasn't true, even though maybe there's something inside their heart that knows that what they said was true. I'm opening up this message with that challenge because this is exactly what's happening to these people Paul is addressing in Rome. Now, Paul is writing to the Roman Christians, and he's writing about some Christians whose faith has become known in all the world. Now, there is a mixture in Rome of both Jews and Greeks. He's not just writing to Jews. He's not just writing to Greeks. There are both of them there. And as Paul's addressing them, there is a persuasion that is coming at them from some people who know the Bible really well. And they're trying to influence them in their perspective. And those people, as they're listening to the message of Paul, have rebuttals. If Paul says something, they counter. Well, I get what you just said, but what about this? And so that's what's happening. And just imagine. So imagine you're a Jew. Put yourself in their worldview. Imagine you're a Jew raised under the law, and you've been raised to believe that you must keep this law in order to be justified before God. Your justification, your means of righteousness will be by way of law keeping. You've built your whole life on this. This is what your forefathers back many generations have believed and have built their lives around. You will be justified before God on the basis of keeping this law that you hold so dear to you. And then along comes somebody And he says this: sin will have no dominion over you, for you are not under law, but under grace. What would you say if somebody came along and said that? You've built your whole life on the fact that you are under the law. And if you're going to be right before God, you better keep the law. And then here comes somebody who says sin will have no dominion over you because you're not under law. You're under grace. This is a direct affront to everything you've ever believed or thought to be true. So probably what you would do is some kind of knee-jerk reaction to quickly dismiss the point, with no mind for the context, with no mind for what it means, with no mind to investigate it. And that's what's happening here. And as Paul brings out these points, there are slanderous charges that are set against Paul. And so Paul gives a response to it. I was messaging with a friend this week, and he brought out Jude verse 10, which says, these people blaspheme, which means to speak against. They speak badly about. These people blaspheme all that they do not understand, and they are destroyed by all that they, like unreasoning animals, understand instinctively. Now, as we were talking about that, the idea that came out is that kind of what I was bringing up in the introduction. If somebody brings a point that's to the contrary of a dearly held belief in your life, most likely you won't hear what they say, because before even hearing it, you will speak badly against what they said, though you don't understand actually what they said, nor the particulars of it. Well, that is a biblical concept, and I don't think in Jude he's specifically talking about, everyday life type stuff, but in principle, it's true that when there's something we don't agree with, we'll just speak against it. And we set up what's called straw men. So if somebody says something we don't agree with, then we will reduce their argument to something really silly and dumb, and then we'll throw arrows at it, because the straw man can't attack back, right? That's what a straw man is, and it's a logical fallacy. Somebody has an idea, and you reduce it to something really dumb, and then you can attack it, and it can't attack back because it has no rebuttal, because it's brainless. It's just a straw man. I'll give you an example. I often write about abortion and being pro-life and the Christian necessity of holding that position. And there is a person without fail that whenever I post on these things, he will say something like, the only thing you want to do is control women's bodies. This is a straw man, because I'm presenting something that's saying that his view is immoral. It is unchristian. And he would pretend to be a Christian. He would say that he is, though he says women have the right to destroy the child in their womb. And I would say, no, you can't be a Christian. That's not loving your neighbor. God is the one forming the baby. And so we've had this conversation. So it's a direct affront, but in response to what I say, all you want to do is control women's bodies. It reduces something that he disagrees with to a silly point that he can easily attack. This is the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And of course, we're not talking about controlling women's bodies. We're saying women can't destroy another person's body. That's actually the argument. But when you reduce it to something silly, that's what happens. So I think this is something that's pretty common to human nature, right? You see something you disagree with, boil it down to a silly argument, and then attack it. And that's what's happening in Romans 3, 1 through 9. So let's look at that first yellow point. This is my translation, so you're not going to see an ESV or anything there. But if you have that, just follow along with me on your sheet that you have. Therefore, what is the advantage of the Jew? What is the profit of the circumcision? Much in every way. Above all else, the oracles of God were entrusted to them. For what? If some did not believe, does not their unfaithfulness nullify God's faithfulness? May it never be. Let God be true, but every man a liar, just as it is written, in order that you might be justified in your words and victorious when you are judged. But if our unrighteousness demonstrates God's righteousness, what shall we say? Isn't God unrighteous to bring wrath? I speak according to man. May it never be. Otherwise, how will God judge the world? But if God's truth by my lie abounds to his glory, why am I still judged as a sinner? And as they blasphemously charge us with saying, why not do bad that good may come? Their condemnation is just. So having just read through it, you see how many rhetoricals Paul brings out? The first one is what I want to look at right there in verse 1, that first light blue portion. They say, therefore, what is the advantage of the Jew? What is the profit of the circumcision? And you have to ask, why would they give that response given what Paul has said between Romans 1 and 2? Well, you'd probably have a good idea. We've been in Romans now 17 weeks, and what is the one thing that we've determined from Romans 1 and 2? That Jews and Greeks are both under the condemnation of God. Paul has pointed this out in Romans 1 and 2, that he started out in Romans 1, Gentiles are under the wrath of God because they disobeyed the laws of nature. The Jews are under the wrath of God because they disobeyed the laws of God. And so if you could boil down chapters 1 and 2, Paul would say of Jews and Gentiles, you're all going to hell. Apart from what he said in Romans 1, 16 and 17, I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to Jews first and also to the Greek. There's this idea that he brought out right there at the start, the gospel's how you're going to save. And then he proved that you cannot be saved under whatever law you happen to be under, whether it be the law of your conscience in nature or the law of the Jews in the Pentateuch. You can't be saved that way. And he says that right at the end of chapter 2, we're in chapter 3 now. There's no chapter breaks here. He just got finished saying, the Gentiles are going to be judging the Jews who had the law, and the Gentiles will stand righteous before God, but the Jews who had the law will be condemned. So you're a Jew. You've been in this your whole life. Later in chapter 9, he talks about how to the Jews belonged the promises. To the Jews belonged the patriarchs. To the Jews belonged the law and the covenants and all of these amazing things. But everything Paul has said in Romans 1 and 2 would bring the person to say, well, then what was the advantage of the Jew? We're the people of God, and yet we're going to hell just the same. In fact, there will be Gentiles who are condemning us. What was the advantage of being a person of God? That's their question. That's a pretty good question, isn't it? Here's what Paul says. So here's the yellow part. He says there were basically a ton of advantages. Because they said, what's the advantage? And Paul said, much in every way. Now, I don't think he gives the full list. There's about 7 other things that he's going to give in chapter 9. He only mentions one of them right here. But he does say there were a lot of advantages. A lot of advantages. But drop down to verse, you don't have verse 9 on that handout. I'm just going to read it to you. You've only got 1 through 8 there, I believe. But in Romans 3, verse 9, look at where Paul's going to go with his argument. He says, they say, what's the advantage? And then Paul says, much in every way. Then he does this big breakdown. And then in verse 9, he says, what then? Are we Jews any better off? No, not at all. What were the advantages? There were very many. Are we Jews any better off? Not at all. Tons of advantages. Not at all better off. What an indictment that must have been. And I presume that's why he said in chapter 2 and verse 9 that the Jews would be judged first in the judgment. And I presume it's why it says later in Scripture that it will be better in the judgment for those that never knew the way of righteousness than for those who did know it and after having given themselves to it, turned back from it. Because God is going to weigh how much information that we had, and we are going to be judged in that regard. So that's interesting. He's going to ultimately say they're not any better off, but he does say that there were advantages, and he gives one that he calls, it more literally says chiefly. It's this Greek word protos that means like first of all. This is the one that rises above everything else, which is why I translated above all else. What were the advantages? Above all else, listen to this, the oracles of God were entrusted to the Jews. What were the advantages? You know, we all stand condemned before God, Jews and Gentiles alike. So were there any advantages? Was there anything advantageous to being God's person? And he says there were many things. And the first thing is something that I think you and I take for granted. We don't even appreciate it. To the Jews, they were entrusted with the very oracles of God, the sayings of God, the words that God had for mankind. Contrary to some of the popular mystical beliefs and the dreamers, God does not speak to us through the subjective. He doesn't speak to us in private. He doesn't speak to us in our dreams or through prophecies or those things any longer. God in these last days has spoken to us by his Son, Hebrews chapter 1, and he's spoken to us through these words which are given to us. I want to talk about an advantage. Over 90% of all of human history and over the majority of people who've lived across the span of the globe, you have a Bible sitting in your lap this morning. That's an advantage. And I presume that there will be many people on the day when Christ appears who had one sitting on a shelf in their home or sitting on a nightstand next to their bed. And they'll say, what advantage did we have? And God may say, you had many. But are you any better off? Not at all. Why not? Well, interestingly, for the American, I would say that part of it is we don't read our Bibles. We have them, but wouldn't we rather read a novel? Wouldn't we rather watch an OU football game? Wouldn't we rather scroll endless social media feeds? Wouldn't we rather listen to talk radio? Wouldn't we rather watch the news? How many things wouldn't we rather ingest into our brains for the daily that will be of no profit eternally? What a great advantage that we have. But again, I suspect that for many of us, we will be no better off for having had that advantage. It is an enormous privilege to live after the Gutenberg printing press and to live during a time where they can get Bibles out to anybody in the world like that. And we have it. And he does say it is an advantage. But why? Even so, I mentioned expressly for the Christian. We may not read it as much as we want to or as much as we should. But what's interesting is the Jews, they did a lot of reading. And they were faithful to the synagogue. And they went and they would listen to the law being read. They would memorize it. Jewish boys had to memorize it. They would memorize huge sections of Scripture. They knew it in that way. But Paul said, remember, toward the end of chapter 2, he says, you know the law and you teach others, but do you teach yourselves? And then he gives an indictment because it failed to penetrate the heart. So even having such an advantage, we have to be aware that it doesn't mean that it's going to get into the heart if we don't approach it the way that Paul is going to bring out through this whole letter to Rome, which is from the standpoint of belief. So we have a big responsibility with those words that we have in our laps this morning. Now, moving on to that next light blue section. We see the chief advantage. But remember in verse 9, Paul says they're no better off. And the people who are reading this are already gathering this information, because that's what Paul just said in chapter 2. He says Gentiles are going to judge the Jews. The Jews had the law, the Gentiles didn't, but the Gentiles are going to judge them. So they're already gathering, they said, well, what was our advantage? And Paul says, well, you had the oracles of God. But, before Paul can even say his next thing, they say, let's read what they say. For what? It's this little Greek phrase, gar. What for? For what? Here's this big advantage. Well, to what end? Is how I think they mean it. Because they say, if some didn't believe, and this is getting real geeky on you, this is what's called a first-class conditional. This is not if some didn't believe, it's since some didn't believe. This is already assumed to be true because Paul just said it. Since some didn't believe, this is already factual, doesn't their unfaithfulness nullify God's faithfulness? What is the point that they're getting at? The very thing that promised life proved to be their condemnation. So to what end is this great advantage that has damned me instead of saved me? Paul later says in Romans chapter 7, the very commandment that promised life proved to be death to me. But then he says, did that which is good, the word of God, then bring death to me? By no means. It was sin producing death in me through what is good, in order that sin might be shown to be sin, and through the commandment become sinful beyond measure. So God had this big plan through something that was really good. Paul says the law is spiritual and it's holy and it's righteous and it's good and there's nothing at all wrong with the law. But he says there was a big problem. It wasn't the law. It was somebody else, and it was something else. It was sin working through you. So they're hearing this kind of stuff. Here's this commandment that actually makes you stand condemned, because he brings out this argument both in Romans and in Galatians that says the one who does them shall live by them. And it's a quotation from the Old Testament. And they misunderstood it. They thought that it meant if you put yourself under the law, then you're going to be alive because of it. But the point of the Old Testament quote that Paul brings out in Romans and Galatians is that if you can actually do all the law, then you get to live. That was his point. But who did that? Well, Paul pointed out, nobody did. So God gave this word, and it promised life, and here I am standing condemned. And having heard that point, what is their argument? What's their rebuttal? Then God must be unfaithful. That is, I think, the central excuse anybody in the world is going to make about just about anything. What's going wrong in your life? Isn't it somebody else's fault? It must be. You see this everywhere in the world. I mean, the more I thought about it, the more I realized this is really central. So I'll start broad, and then I'll move to specific for Christians. I listened one time to an interview from this, I think the guy might be from England, but Stephen Fry. He's a comedian, but he's also a pretty smart guy, intellectual, atheist. They said, what would you say to God if God happens to be true? Because he doesn't believe that he is, but he still has a lot of hostility against a God that he doesn't believe is true. So he said, I would say to him, bone cancer in children, how dare you? So here's a problem that I think all of humanity recognizes: cancer, disease, bad things, injustices, all of these kinds of things. But his first question wouldn't be what has man done to promote or bring this, but God is at fault. And you see it in so much. I mean, it's in everything. I mean, we're understanding now, even through diet, how much we can change our physical health. You think about the ways that greed and the sins of men and the desire for riches has brought disease to the world. Most of the foods, this is not a dietary lesson, but most of the foods that we have in our grocery stores are filled with polyunsaturated fats. That they're now connecting it with heart disease, Alzheimer's, cancer, diabetes, type 2, which they're saying can even be reversed if you get off of that stuff. It's in absolutely everything. Why? Because it's cheap and it's tasteless. You can cook the food in something cheap and it won't affect the flavor. We can eat something that tastes good, but it's bad for our bodies. All because some people at the top want to make more money. And the first place that we look is if there's somebody at fault. Who is it? God, not me. I would venture to guess that there have been moments in your life, perhaps even right now. Again, why am I bringing this out? Because that's what they said. God gave an advantage, but people were unfaithful within the advantage. And they said, well, then it must be God's fault because God said that we would have life through it. And it didn't actually bring life. And rather than looking at self, they said God was the problem. I think that's something that we might do. There have been times in my life where I knew something scripturally and biblically to be a point of fact, but because I wasn't believing it in my heart, I was not bearing the fruit of it. The Bible says what? We serve a God who will grant to us a peace that surpasses understanding, a peace in the midst of turmoil that the world could never understand, that somehow we have. How many of us have heard that promise and at many times been in absolute turmoil, thinking to ourselves, I'm not so sure that that promise is actually true. God promised peace, and yet I cannot bring myself out of an anxiety, despite the scripture's constant demand from the beginning to end, do not be anxious about your life. Don't be anxious about what you'll eat. Don't be anxious about anything, Philippians chapter 4. It gives the command, it promises peace, and you know all of that stuff very well in your head. But it doesn't seem to work no matter how much you read the Bible. God is calling us to live sanctified. God says, for freedom, Christ has set you free. In Jesus Christ, you are free from the law of sin and death that would indict you on account of one sin, thereby freeing you from the sin so you don't have to do it anymore. But how many, despite the claims of the Bible to bring us to sanctification, are still living at a point in our private lives that wouldn't look any different than somebody who does not know Jesus at all? And what would be our first thought? God, the Bible, must be the problem. It does not work. This is what they're doing. If some were unfaithful with this great advantage that God gave that was supposed to give life, then God must be, then doesn't that nullify the faithfulness of God? Now we're moving on to that last yellow part, the second yellow part. I love being able to do that as my outline, just color coding. But Paul says to their objection to his response, in the strongest terms in the Greek language, to say, what you just said is dead wrong. Me genito. It means by no means, or may it never be. This is as far from the truth as you can imagine. It's the same thing that he says. I've got an arrow that points to the other part where he says it again. By no means, that you could not be more wrong in the way you're looking at it. So you say you're living your life and there's a problem and you assume that it was not man, or you assume it wasn't you, and thereby it was God. He would say that's never the case, ever. There's a problem in your life, it's never the fault of God, which is why he says, let God be true and every man a liar. Now, immediately, in the immediate context, truth and, true and liar is going to point to what he'd said before, doesn't their unfaithfulness nullify God's faithfulness? See, unfaithfulness is lying. Faithfulness is being true. And they're saying, isn't God actually the one that's untrue? Isn't God the one who lied here? And he says, no. Here's something that you ought to consider. You ought to consider that God is true, but every single person is the problem. That's what you ought to think. Now, why would he use the words true and liar? Because that is an encapsulation of everything he said between chapters 1 and 2. In chapter 1 and verse 25, it says this. It says, God revealed himself to them in the clearest way possible through the creation so that they're without excuse. But they, desiring to worship the creature, exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped the creature rather than the creator. Now, what did he say in chapter 1 of the Gentiles? God gave truth. What did man do with it? They suppressed it, and they embraced rather a lie. How does that fit into what Paul's saying? Let God be true and every man a liar. God gave the truth. Man embraced a lie. And then in chapter 2, he says this of the Jews. He says, you dishonor God by breaking the law of God that you're esteeming. But he actually says this in 2:20. He says, in the law, you had the embodiment of knowledge and truth. Who gives truth? Who's true? Who's faithful? Who has stood by us? Who has not smited the world? Who continues to work with us despite our sinfulness? Who remains true to his covenant despite the many times that we broke it? In Jeremiah 31, it says, you broke my covenant, though I was your husband, declares the Lord. And in Hosea's prophecy, the whole point of the prophecy was, Hosea, go marry a prostitute, and your marriage is going to be a representation of God and Israel, so that when she goes off and commits sin and she's unfaithful, I'll be true to her. Let God be true and every man a liar. What does he mean by a liar? It doesn't just mean that you're expressing false things out of your mouth, although that's going to be part of it. It means leaving God and the truth that he has given for things that are not true and that will not profit. Let God be true and every man a liar. So this morning, there are two things that I think we should take away from the message. Number one, we're immeasurably blessed to have the Bible and to have these words that God has given us. And in the midst of that blessing, we have to understand that it's a multifaceted approach. You know, where Paul said last week, you're not going to be saved by the letter. It's not these words that are going to save you. But what is it within those words that will save you? Your faith. Believe in God with all of your heart. And the second part of the takeaway of the message is, if ever there's a problem, it is not God's fault. Now, that does not mean that it's expressly your fault. If you have a disease that came from food that a big corporation brought, you might just be the recipient of somebody else's fault. We see that kind of thing happen all the time. Little kids, my dad the other night, he works for Child Protective Services. In the middle of the night, or well, late at night, he was working on this case, and there's this kid who's 10 years old, and the kid has been from shelter to shelter, foster home to foster home, all around the system. And the kid was cursing continuously and threatening to hurt, the caretakers of him. My dad had to go and get him, drive 3 hours at 11 at night, pick him up, and then bring him 3 hours somewhere else, and then fill out paperwork. It was an all-night long venture. Here's a 10-year-old who's inherited some things that probably were not his fault. But we can know they weren't God's fault. God is true always. We serve a good God. And despite what you are enduring right now, whether it be a disease of the body, a disease of the mind, or some really difficult scenario, Paul is going to build this case through Romans. We serve a faithful God. Later in Romans chapter 8, he's going to say, I am convinced that neither life nor death, nor height nor depths, nor angels, nor rulers, nor principalities, nor famine, nor sword, nor any of these things can separate us from the love of God. It remains, and God is faithful by our side through all of it. And I think as we sing in that song, we will understand it better by and by, even if right now we don't. We serve a true God. He is true to those suffering in diseases. He's true to those suffering in the mind. And whatever you're in, call out to him. And as I will say 1,000 more times before the series is over, believe God with all of your heart. Put your trust in him. Stand on him. You can trust in him. And he will grant a peace that surpasses understanding if you believe.